The Second World War was not merely a conflict, it was the greatest cataclysm in human history. It was the biggest, most destructive, and bloodiest struggle ever documented. Every continent was touched by the flames of this war. Yes, even the frozen wastes of the Antarctic saw military activity. From the dense jungles of Southeast Asia to the scorched deserts of North Africa, and from the sophisticated cities of Europe to the remote islands of the Pacific, no corner of the globe was safe. It was a war of staggering contrasts. It was fought in the mud of ancient trenches and on horseback reminiscent of the past. Yet, it was also the first war where humanity reached toward the future, with combat occurring for the first time in space via suborbital rockets, and culminating in the terrifying power of nuclear weapons. The world that emerged in 1945 was unrecognizable compared to the one that entered the fray in 1939. The great European empires, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, were shattered beyond repair. Their centuries of global dominance were over. In their place, two new titans arose: the United States and the Soviet Union. This shift didn't just end a war, it birthed the Cold War, a standoff that would define the next 50 years. In Asia, the chaos of the conflict paved the way for the Chinese Communist Party's rise to power, led to the tragic partition of the Korean Peninsula, and sparked the fire of independence in India. To understand our modern world, we must understand this war. When did it start? Why did it happen? And who fought where? This is everything you need to know. Part 2. The Gathering Storm, 1937 to 1939. To pinpoint exactly when World War II began, you must first ask where you are standing. For many, the answer is September 1st, 1939. But for millions in Asia, the nightmare began much earlier. Since 1937, Japan and China had been locked in a brutal, full-scale struggle. Japan, a rising industrial power with a desperate need for resources, had invaded Manchuria years earlier and was now pushing deep into the Chinese heartland. This conflict, marked by the horrific events in Nanking, set the stage for the Pacific War. In Europe, the seeds of conflict were sown in the ashes of the First World War. The 1930s saw the rise of three aggressive dictatorships known as the Axis powers: Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. They were driven by a shared hunger for empire, territory, and living space. Adolf Hitler, having seized absolute power in Germany, dismantled democracy and began a campaign of systematic persecution against Jews, political opponents, and minorities. By 1938, Hitler was testing the resolve of the international community. He annexed Austria and then demanded parts of Czechoslovakia. The Western powers, hoping to avoid another Great War, practiced a policy of appeasement. They gave in to his demands, believing he would eventually be satisfied. They were wrong. Hitler's true dream was a vast empire in the east, the fertile plains of Ukraine and the oil fields of the Caucasus. In August 1939, the world was shocked by a deal with the devil. Hitler and his ideological arch-nemesis, Joseph Stalin of the USSR, signed a non-aggression pact. Hidden in this agreement was a secret plan to invade Poland and split it between them. On September 1st, German tanks rolled across the Polish border. This time, Britain and France realized that talk was over. They declared war on Germany. The second great fire of the century had been lit. Part 3. The Fall of France and the Miracle of Britain, 1940. The early months of the war were strangely quiet in Western Europe, a period known as the Phony War. But in the shadows, the German Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, was preparing to strike. While the Soviet Union struggled in its invasion of Finland, German U-boats began a relentless campaign in the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships to starve Britain of food and fuel. The silence broke in April 1940. Germany swept through Denmark in hours and launched a daring invasion of Norway to secure vital iron ore supplies. The failure of the Allies to stop this led to a political explosion in London. Winston Churchill, a man who had long warned of the Nazi threat, became prime minister. He had no time to celebrate. On the very day he took office, Germany launched a massive invasion of the Low Countries and France. The German strategy was a masterclass in deception. While the Allies rushed north into Belgium to meet what they thought was the main attack, German armored divisions surged through the impassable Ardennes forest. Within 10 days, they reached the English Channel, cutting the Allied armies in half. Hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers were trapped against the sea at the town of Dunkirk. What followed was the Miracle of Dunkirk. A flotilla of nearly 900 ships, including fishing boats, yachts, and lifeboats, braved German bombs to rescue 340,000 men. It was a defeat, but a defeat that felt like a victory. Shortly after, France fell, and Hitler stood triumphant in Paris. Britain stood alone. Hitler expected Churchill to sue for peace, but Churchill's answer was a defiant no. The Battle of Britain followed, the first major campaign fought entirely in the air. The German Luftwaffe attempted to crush the Royal Air Force to pave the way for an invasion, but the British had a secret weapon: radar. This technology allowed them to intercept German raids with surgical precision. When Hitler failed to win air superiority, he turned to the Blitz, the systematic night bombing of British cities like London and Coventry. Yet, the British spirit did not break. By late 1940, Hitler was forced to postpone his invasion plans. He turned his eyes back to the east. Part 4: The World at War, 1941. 1941 was the year the conflict truly became global. In June, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. He broke his pact with Stalin and sent nearly 4 million men into the Soviet Union. The scale of the violence was unprecedented. Whole Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. To Hitler, this was a war of annihilation, a struggle between races. By December, German soldiers could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. But the Russian winter arrived with a vengeance. Temperatures plummeted, freezing German machinery and soldiers alike. The Soviets, led by General Zhukov, launched a massive counteroffensive that pushed the exhausted Germans back. The Blitzkrieg had failed. The war in the East would be a long, grinding war of attrition. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, another storm was breaking. Japan, facing an oil embargo by the United States, decided on a desperate gamble. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Japanese carrier-based planes struck the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It was a devastating blow, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and killing over 2,400 Americans. President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared it a date which will live in infamy. America was in the war. A few days later, in one of his greatest strategic blunders, Hitler declared war on the United States. Now, the industrial might of America, the vast manpower of the Soviet Union, and the stubborn resilience of the British Empire were united against the Axis. The Japanese, however, were not finished. They rapidly conquered Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, reaching the very gates of India and Australia. Part 5: The Turning Tide, 1942 to 1943. If 1941 was about Axis expansion, 1942 was the year the momentum stalled. In the Pacific, the Americans scored a miraculous victory at the Battle of Midway. By breaking Japanese naval codes, they ambushed the Japanese fleet, sinking 4 of their irreplaceable aircraft carriers. The Japanese Navy would never truly recover its offensive power. In North Africa, the Desert Fox, German General Erwin Rommel, had pushed the British back to the doorstep of Cairo. But at the Battle of El Alamein, the British Eighth Army under Bernard Montgomery smashed the Axis lines. Shortly after, American and British troops landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch. The Axis forces in Africa were now caught in a giant vice. But the most pivotal struggle of the war was happening in a city on the Volga River, Stalingrad. For 5 months, German and Soviet troops fought room to room, floor to floor in the ruins of the city. It was the bloodiest battle in human history. In November 1942, the Soviets launched a massive pincer movement surrounding the German Sixth Army. In February 1943, nearly 100,000 surviving German soldiers surrendered. It was the psychological turning point of the war. 1943 saw the Allies go on the offensive. In July, the Germans tried one last great gamble in the east at the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. They failed. From that point on, the German army in the east was in a state of permanent retreat. In the Mediterranean, the Allies invaded Sicily and then the Italian mainland. Mussolini was toppled from power, and Italy surrendered, though German forces occupied the country and continued a brutal defensive struggle. In the Pacific, the Americans began their island hopping campaign, seizing strategic bases while bypassing Japanese strongholds, slowly tightening the noose around the Japanese home islands. Part 6: Victory and a New Reality, 1944 to 1945. By 1944, the Axis was crumbling. In the East, the Soviet steamroller was crushing everything in its path. In the West, the greatest amphibious invasion in history was about to take place. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, 150,000 Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, France. Despite heavy casualties, they breached Hitler's Atlantic Wall. By August, Paris was liberated. Hitler's final desperate move came in December 1944. He launched a massive counterattack through the Ardennes, creating a bulge in the Allied lines. But the Battle of the Bulge ended in a costly German defeat. They had used up their last reserves of fuel and men. 1945 was the year of the end. In April, the Soviet Red Army reached Berlin. The city was turned into a graveyard. On April 30th, as Soviet shells fell near his underground bunker, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. On May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over, revealing the full horror of the Holocaust, the industrial scale murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others in concentration camps. But Japan fought on. American bombers were turning Japanese cities to ash, yet the Japanese government refused to surrender. Faced with the prospect of a bloody invasion that could cost millions of lives, President Harry Truman authorized the use of a terrifying new weapon. On August 6, 1945, a single B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb hit Nagasaki. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. The double shock was too much. On September 2, 1945, Japan officially surrendered aboard the USS Missouri. The Second World War was over. It left behind a world in ruins, 50 million dead, entire cities erased, and a map redrawn. Germany was divided. The Iron Curtain began to descend across Europe. The nuclear age had begun. We still live in the shadow of those 6 years, a time when humanity showed its greatest capacity for evil and its most heroic resolve for freedom. World War II was more than a series of battles and dates on a map. It was a period that tested the very limits of human endurance, cruelty, and courage. By the time the guns fell silent in 1945, the world had been fundamentally reshaped. Borders were redrawn, empires crumbled, and a new era of global tension began. But beyond the politics and the power struggles, we must remember the individuals, the millions of stories lost to the wind, and the millions more that define the world we inhabit today. Thank you for spending these 15 minutes with us, diving into one of the most complex chapters of our collective history. If this journey through the past offered you a new perspective, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue telling these vital stories. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this history surprised you the most? Until next time, stay curious and never stop exploring the lessons of the past. Thank you for watching.